Anyway, before we get into the modern effluvia that we have to talk about here this week, because it kind of ties, a lot of it does, into Kevin Sullivan, the biography on the Steiner brothers, Rick and Scott Steiner, that was on. I won't do what you do and say AEW. It was on A&E, that network.
You were
people
about to do
actually
it.
watch.
You were about to do it, weren't you?
And I caught myself.
I never do. I never do.
It's so similar. Maybe Tony will buy A&E because it's confusingly similar. That way people will be tuning in thinking they're watching, you know, a cooking class or something, and up will pop the wrestling. Anyway, the biography, you saw this episode, did you not?
Oh, absolutely. I wish this one was 2 hours. Usually they're 2 hours. This one was a quick 1 hour, but I enjoyed it.
Yeah, and again, we talk about that so many of the A&E programs at this point are cross-pollinated with the rivalries and the biographies and the heels and the baby faces and the water boys and all the various series they have. They have not done that much on the Steiners. And so a lot of this stuff, obviously you weren't seeing it for the first time if you have been a fan of the Steiners, but seeing stuff that you haven't seen in a long time in terms of the wrestling footage, and then, you know, getting a chance to, because when was the last time we saw, especially with Scott, a sit-down interview with Scott Steiner on a network program? Not on a wrestling show, not when he's being Big Poppa Pump, but when he's just being himself, which, as you can tell, there's sometimes not a lot of fucking line of demarcation there.
Yeah, where else do we get to see an interview with the most understanding woman in the world, aka the wife of Scott Steiner?
Yeah. But no, that's the thing, is that for good or bad, because of Scott's being mostly Scott, Rick is, you know, Rick doesn't have that many personal issues with people, and is the more laid back of the two. But Scott was on the outs with the WWE for years and years, to the point where and I'm sure he probably got a fucking kick out of this at the time. Like, yeah, fucking good thing for them. What was the show? What was the WrestleMania year or whatever, when they put his picture up backstage and said, "Do not admit this man, call police," or whatever the fuck? When was that?
I don't remember. It must have been about a decade ago, but I think Hogan was there, which prompted it, because he had just threatened to do whatever to Hogan like the day before, or within days of that.
Yeah, he was going to fucking stretch Hogan for some reason, and they're probably valid. You know, but they put his picture up back there, and it was fucking hilarious, because, you know, or was that a Russo thing, do you think? Was it me just fucking lighting up Russo to the point where he panics and fucking puts out a restraining order, or was Hogan just like shitting himself like shit stained wood? Or of course, Scott would have been down there in a couple of minutes if he'd have had the thought cross his mind. But
yeah, I think with Scott, there was the threat that things could get very physical and no one could stop it.
Well, anyway, but now they're in the Hall of Fame. Rick's progeny is about to be the biggest star in the wrestling business, and they get their own biography on AEW. See, I did that just for you, and you didn't even sell it.
You know, the problem, too, I'll just bring it up here because you bring up Bron Breakker. I apologize for Swami barking at the mailman in the background. But don't you think that this biography almost points out how ridiculous it is that his name's not Bron Steiner?
Well, yeah. And I mean, it's been ridiculous since day one. We talked about it. Why not Bron Steiner? Because, you know, everybody, if you didn't know, how could you not know? If you don't know, your ass better call somebody. How would you not? I mean, there's no fucking suspecting the milkman here in this relationship.
Well, he certainly looks like a Steiner. He should be named Steiner. Everyone knows he's a Steiner, and his dad was even been on NXT TV with him. It's ridiculous that they gave him a name just so they could own it, but...
Well, they're now calling the clothesline the Steiner line and the Frankensteiner. So, but
they just can't own Steiner. I mean, again, he came in under Vince. You have to wonder if it would be different now. If he came in, they could actually take advantage of heritage. Because one of the things under Vince, and we'll see how Triple H does with this, at a certain point, it was almost bad to be a second-generation wrestler. Remember Kurt Hennig's son? They gave him multiple names. Not one of them was Hennig.
Oh, God, yes. Well, but now here's the thing. As soon as he achieves his first milestone level of success, championship, whatever they deem that to be, that's when he can come out and say, okay, now I can use my name because I'm not trading on my old man because I'm better than my old man now because he'll still be a heel, whatever. So it's possible it could happen. I think just, again, they don't seem as hard and fast. Ari and the gang there, the Hollywood crowd, as with Vince's rules as Vince was and made people be. So it could be open. But yeah, right now, everybody knows because he's in this fucking show. And they're talking, and my son. So anyway, Bron Breakker Steiner. Maybe they'll hyphenate it like these ladies that get married but want to keep their own name, and then they become Gertrude Wildebeest Foofingham.
Well, talking about the Steiners, they go back to the very beginning, the Rex Steiners, I guess we should say, and it's kind of weird seeing images of Rick and Scott as children growing up, just the size difference as they're getting older. Rick Steiner with lots of hair and no facial hair. It's a real trip seeing that stuff.
Well, and I'd never seen those. Obviously, I didn't ask him, hey, can I see your fucking baby pictures? But it's like you don't expect them to look like normal humans in some cases because they've always been these genetic freaks and these, unique people. And they were from Bay City, Michigan. They wrestled in high school, wrestled in college at Michigan. And they made a big deal of talking about their parents were very strict. Their father was, he looked like a real strict conservative type of fella from the Leave It to Beaver era. So, but their personalities, Rick said it best. Well, when we went to college, got away from dad, we went wild. So I'm wondering if this is a cautionary tale for maybe advocating permissive parenting, because the first thing they did at college was take a guy's car and put it on the 50-yard line at the football stadium. And I mean, we've told stories about these, they not malicious and not trying to fuck with people's property and not just being vandals or whatever the fuck, but they were stiff with goddamn ribs and it would fuck. And it's not like that they would have a problem if somebody fucked back with them like that. They would laugh about it too and then get you back. But everybody was scared to retaliate in many cases. But anyway, more on the ribs in a little while when they start talking about them. But it was cool seeing that early footage where Rick was introduced as Rob Recksteiner. And he's got the fuzzy hair by that point. He's jacked, but you could tell he's kind of like, what the fuck's going on around here? But as we mentioned, when we've talked about him before, when we talked about Bron, Rick picked it up so quick because it said January 85 was his debut on AWA television. And he's in Mid-South by fucking 86 and
by late 85. He came in at the end of 85.
That's right. Well, by the next year, he's looking like he's somebody and he's Rick Steiner now. So, I mean, it was very quick because I was watching, all the territory TVs that were still remaining, right? And in 86, I was seeing, Mid-South and CNN guys like, what the fuck? And then by the time he came to work for Crockett, even that was 87, again, exponentially better in 2 years. And now, I guess I've got it in the notes here somewhere, but we're like 2 years or a little removed from Bron's debut in NXT. And I think he's better at this stage than Rick was.
It's interesting. You never hear Rick Steiner on a list of people that was a Vern Gagne student. and they talked about it here. And the other thing, you never hear anything about the late, like 84, 85, 86, the territories still kind of operating like the territories. The idea that Jack Lanza and the AWA sent him to work for Watts, again, think of where things were in the middle of 1985 in terms of what Vince McMahon was doing and what everyone else was doing to react to it. It's wild that they were still doing that he was still sending them out there to get seasoned.
Well, but that probably wasn't official. And see, that was the thing. And he had met George Steele, the Animal, who, before he became so popular later in his career as George the Animal Steele, remember, George Steele, Jim Myers, he would teach at in Michigan. He would teach school 9 months out of the year and then go to work the summer for Vince Sr. as George the Animal Steele in the early 70s, right? And then he started making so much money, and he would work for Sheik in Detroit or whatever. But he started making so much money in the wrestling business, he quit teaching. But since he was from Michigan and he had been an amateur, and hey, you need to go train with Vern Gagne. And this was 1984 because Vince wasn't training anybody. And at that point, George Steele was like, he was not just and Jack Lanza. They were not just agents for Vince. That's what they did, for their jobs or, whatever. But they knew everybody in the business. So if they saw a guy that just needed a break or some place to train, they said, well, you ought to call so-and-so, or here, let me try to put a word in for you.
There weren't too many options either.
Right, and that's off the clock type of stuff, where it wouldn't be going through Vince wouldn't give a shit at that point.
I mean, if you think about it, if any wrestler in that period of time met someone and they thought this guy should be a wrestler, either they were going to train him or they had to have somewhere to send him, and there weren't too many options.
Yeah, so...
What, were we going to send him to Larry Sharp?
Well, it ended up... he got about the late 80s when all the regular territories had ceased, he got the business by default.
Yeah, that's right.
But anyway, so that's how, and you would see Rick Steiner and you go, okay, somebody can do something with him. And, so anyway, that's the way that happened. And I loved, again, because I knew Rick by this point, and he was working in Crockett, I was paying attention when his brother Scott starts working in was it Bruiser trying to restart it, or was somebody else just using the WWA name in 86, Ohio, Indiana, and a bit of Michigan? Jerry Graham Jr. have something to do with it?
He may have, but I think Bruiser was still involved.
Well, but I mean,
WWA at that point.
He wasn't wrestling by that point on most of the shows or whatever, and it was a really low budget attempt at a resurgence. I mean, he probably owned something in the background, but the point being, it wasn't something that a lot of people were seeing at that point in time.
No, which is why I was surprised when they showed the footage of him beating the Great Wojo. Really good crowd reaction. I was like, wow, I didn't think there would be anyone there. But they actually still had a respectable audience, I guess.
Well, but I mean, look at the size of the building. Was there 1,500 or 2,000 people there, which back in the 80s for any type of promoted wrestling show under Bruiser's, fucking name, even the WWA, it should have done something. But point being, they didn't have, I don't think, any television at that point in Indianapolis. I'm pretty sure may have had something like Toledo, whatever the case. But Greg Wojciechowski, the Great Wojo, had been a hotshot amateur, I think, with major credentials.
Oh, yeah.
And I think he'd done some work in Japan, right? Probably for Inoki. Did he not?
I don't recall, actually.
I thought that at some point they brought him over as a shooter, but he was a high-level international amateur, decorated, blah, blah, blah. And the Great Wojo, because nobody could pronounce Wojciechowski, and I can't spell it. And they had put the belt on him, and then it was the same principle. When they not only they saw Scott Steiner and the physical impression that he made to begin with, and his credentials, in school, but also they figure, oh, his brother is working for Jim Crockett. He's on TBS. Maybe we could get a date on him, or we see that kind of thing. So because I'm not downplaying Scott's potential, but they put the belt on him over the Great Wojo in his first match. And contemporaneously, as I was keeping up with it and getting the clippings, I think Brian Hildebrand, as a matter of fact, was around this area and probably went to some of the shows and shot. It looked like they were giving Scott Steiner a big push because Rick was a star on television and there's his brother. But at the same point, he grew into it fairly quickly.
If you remember, when the Steiner brothers hit, all the Apter magazines had ads for WWA matches with Scott Steiner. It was all about young Scott Steiner. And whenever you finally saw that footage, I mean, it was crazy. He was doing stuff that some of the high flyers today don't do. He was doing like a 450 splash in the middle of the ring.
Yeah. And, well, he was like Brock Lesnar. They had to calm him down for his own good as far as keeping his body in the shape he was able to keep it in, doing all that stuff, right? If he'd have done everything he did from the start, he'd have fucking broke down before then. But anyway, that was the thing, is that you knew you had something with both of these guys. Everybody who saw them said, "Oh, you got to go train with somebody good." And with the WWA, oh shit, this guy's going to be a star. His brother's already a star, and holy shit, we'll sell his tapes or whatever. We'll push him to the moon. But I don't know that Scott was there. Again, how quick they were, how quick studies and quick developing. I don't even think they put it was 2 years, 2 or 2.5 years tops with Scott too. By the time he has that first match and wins their world title in Toledo he's on TBS.
Yeah, he was in Memphis at the end of '88, I think. Right?
Yes. Because he had to, there had to be some kind of middle ground there. And I think that's, again, another time Memphis was able, as one of the last places left at that point in time, to just give him 7 nights a week of work and live TV.
Yeah, think about who was there at that same time. Him, Cactus Jack, Sid Vicious. 3 guys, very different, that would go on to be 3 of the top guys of the 90s.
And, in this biography, that they skipped the Crockett run almost entirely. And I know the focus was the Steiner brothers, but, Rick was, I don't think they told the story of how popular and successful Rick had been, boom, 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 in that point in time. But as you mentioned, it was only 46 minutes plus commercials. So, but by early '89, here come the Steiner brothers in WCW, and then you get to see all those highlights. And Jesus Christ, again, I got kind of used to it when I was seeing it on the monitor every fucking TV taping. But they just picked these guys up and just put them anywhere they wanted to. It was fucking amazing. Andor could turn them in any position. I mean, Ronnie Garvin used to tickle the guys on a boring Saturday morning TBS taping by taking a job guy. The poor fella obviously looked like a piece of shit, but they were trying to, be part of the thing and do favors for guys. But he'd take the guy's own index finger and make him pick his own nose and eat it and shit like that. But the Steiners took just a whole new level of, what the fuck? You had no idea where you were going, but they reasonably put you down well, if that makes any sense. Most of the time.
Most of the time. There may be some times that they didn't. I'll tell you, we'll talk a little bit about it here. I'm such a mark for the Steiner brothers from '89 until, let's say, '94. And when they first hit, there was nothing like them. I mean, the Road Warriors are like big, painted up, shoulder pads, big, like monsters almost. You believe that the Steiners could handle them.
Yes.
Just based on how they handled themselves. And their matches were spectacular. A few years back, when everyone, and it's funny thinking about it now where they are now, when everyone was going crazy about how the Young Bucks should be in the Hall of Fame, and thank God that didn't happen. I mean, again, look where they are now. I would say the Steiner brothers go watch those matches. It's not just the innovation. There are very few babyface tag teams ever that got those kind of reactions mid-match to everything they did. And those WCW fans, and it was tough to be a WCW fan for a lot of that time period, the Steiners were guys that gave you optimism. Until they were gone in 92, every time there was a Steiner Brothers match, you had to see it. The matches they had with random, to the American fans, random Japanese wrestlers, some of the all-time greats from New Japan of that era, Tatsumi Fujinami, I mean, everyone was in the ring with them. They destroyed everyone. You've never seen anything like it. Go watch Wrestle War 92 before the actual War Games match. They have a match that lights up that audience. It's like nothing you've ever seen before. There are very few tag teams that have ever hit the way they hit. And again, WCW wasn't doing big business, but that wasn't their fault. They were one of the few bright spots in WCW.
Oh, well, and it started in 1990 when Jesus, they hadn't been together as a team for 6 months. You know, we talk about, yes, sometimes when you go back and look at the highlights with the job guys, a lot of the job guys didn't know how to take bumps either. Some of their bumps they were just given, but there was some awkward things going on. But in that time period, with them only having been in the business for a couple of years and having only 6 months as a team, the team in the whole company that the Midnight Express and I wanted to work with was the Steiner brothers and the Southern Boys. For the, you know, we had wonderful matches with them because they got it also in a completely different way. But the Steiners were so over, and if you knew what you were doing and you didn't fight them on trying to get their shit in, they were the easiest team to work with. And I know people call bullshit. No, with the Midnight, they were the easiest team to work with. Because if you watch them, the Nasty Boys or the Road Warriors or the Japanese teams or whatever, like you're talking about, those guys were also strong, ball-busting teams, right? Slobber knocker people. It's got to be a fight. You're going to clothesline, punch, boom, 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 boom. And so the Steiners even had to fight to get their shit in, right? The Midnight was it was like Tully and Arn, completely different style team. We're going to do all of their shit and take bigger bumps and put it over facially and with the body language because that's the style of team we are. And then to get heat on them, we're going to go from behind. We're going to use the racket. We're going to double team, triple team, and not make them look weak. And then on the fucking comeback, we're going to do all our shit again. And so they liked working with the Midnight because it was a night off for them. And they were very careful with Bobby and Stan and me because they respected what we were doing. Same thing as the Road Warriors, same formula. They knew we were going to do all their shit and fly for them. And so they would let us get our shit when it was time to get our shit. You didn't have to fight for it. That's why the matches worked. So anyway, that's why the matches were good, and we all enjoyed working with each other, right? And they could be careful and not hurt you. They never potatoed me a bit. But the Ribs now, they were stiffer in the locker room because they talked about, you know, Lex Luger talked about them stretching him. And, you know, all of the guys they used to duct tape, they duct taped Disco Inferno in the parking lot at Universal Studios and TNA one time, and they duct taped, I can't remember who, but guys would be. But
when you say they duct tape people, and they said it here, and how does that start?
Well, let's see. It could just be going back and forth verbally. And somebody zings somebody, oh, well, fuck, come here. Or it could be they just see somebody and they got a roll of duct tape and
do they always have a roll of duct tape? Is duct tape a usual thing that you find in a wrestling locker room?
Well, in the Steiner's bags, it was. Because it's better than the padlocks. Because I remember in the WWF, and as a matter of fact, I'm pretty sure they got me one time that it was them. But a number of guys would do the padlock rib in the 80s where they'd have like the master lock, like a school locker, right? And they would either fucking put it around your suit bag or your wrestling bag handles and padlock it to a locker where you had to go get the bolt cutters to get your bag and leave the building, or from the janitor, or you'd come back from working and there, in addition to your already heavy bag, there'd be like 8 or 12 fucking padlocks hanging off of it that you couldn't get. So you had to drag that whole thing around. The duct tape was not as bad because at least somebody could just get a knife or a pair of scissors, but they could actually duct tape you. And so if a guy was leaning on the rail and they caught him, they'd just duct tape his fucking wrists around the railing in the arena when the doors were about to open and the fans were about to come in, and they'd pull his fucking pants down around his ankles and even try to figure out how to cover up his dangling fucking ding-a-ling. Or, like they said in the documentary, they had duct taped the Nasty Boys, hands behind them like they're handcuffed and their, ankles together. But they would do that again to people out in the parking lot, to a goddamn railing, or out in the building. Well, remember when because they lived in Georgia, so when we do the WCW TVs in Savannah or Macon or something like that, they'd ride down together in a car, Rick and Scott, and they would bring Scott's dog Arnold, who actually managed them when they worked for me in Smoky Mountain Wrestling. And Arnold was a pit bull and was, you think, fairly lovable, but he sounded like the most goddamn mad dog you've ever seen in a horror movie. And Scott had him on a leash, but he'd get out about 10 feet in front of Scott with this thing, and Scott could have him chase guys at command, right? And when he found out that Bobby Eaton was kind of nervous around big, mean-looking dogs anyway, one time in Savannah at the Civic Center, the doors are opening and the fans are coming in the front door, and there comes fucking Bobby Eaton in his underwear and barefoot and fucking holding his goddamn towel around his neck as he's running out of the goddamn breezeway. And there comes Scott Steiner with his pit bull on a 10-foot leash, chasing him around through the goddamn ringside and back in the other side. And the people are going, what the fuck's going on? And he chased him all the way. And then another time they got after Bobby. Bobby had his boots on. And they chased him into the bathroom, and he got on the stall, and he was standing up on the toilet seat and holding on to the top of the stall, and the Steiner ripped the fucking door off the goddamn deal so that Arnold could get in. And he said, sing him. And Arnold clamped down on Bobby's boot, and he could work. He wasn't even biting the boot. He would grab your foot with the boot in his mouth and like that. And Bobby's petrified until he realized he's not really trying to hurt him. So we worked that spot with the Heavenly Bodies in Smoky Mountain, where they could get Arnold to Jimmy Del Rey's boot. But anyway, and there. Remember, I told you, I think last week on the show or on the Drive-Thru, they duct taped Kevin Sullivan's son to the rail. They didn't pull his pants down, but they duct taped him to the rail for acting up when he was 12 years old or whatever. But I've told you the story of Amarillo, right? When we left the Civic Center and stopped at that convenience store.
I'm not sure.
Okay, well, me and Bobby and Stan, and we're in the convenience store on the service road. Everybody in West Texas know what I'm talking about. It's a road that goes to the right of the interstate, but only one way along, and that's where all the businesses are. And there's a ramp, and you get off and on the interstate every so often. And on the other side, it's the same thing. It's a West Texas thing, service road. So we're at this store, and all Rick and Scott come in. And there's no other fans in there. There's nobody else in there except the guy working there. But we're trying to kayfabe, and they just start talking to us because they don't give a shit. Hey, fuck you, Bobby Eaton. Because that was Rick's favorite fucking greeting for Bobby. Fuck you, Bobby Eaton. And we turn around, and Rick has pulled a goddamn handgun the size of a Dirty Harry movie out of his fucking fanny pack, and he's just standing there holding it, showing it to fucking Bobby. He's like, what the fuck? The guy's ringing the shit up in the store. He's not noticing anything. and he sticks it back in. And this was 1990, right? So you could fly around with shit like this. Apparently, I don't know. Maybe they bought it when they got to town. So anyway, we're like, fuck, this fucking guy's gonna think we're all gonna rob him. Let's get out of here. And me and Bobby stand, get in the car. We turn out, we're going down the service road. And on the left of the service road, like I said, is the interstate. It's up about 20 feet higher, the interstate, on an embankment. And, they got it graded off and everything, right? So a couple seconds later, here come Rick and Scott in a rental car of some description on that service road up behind us with their lights flashing. And he decides, I think it was Scott driving, that he's going to go around. He goes to the left and drives up so he's driving alongside us on the embankment, kind of sideways in between the interstate and the service road. And Rick is firing that gun up in the air out of the window. Bang, 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 say! And off they go. And they're just, on the way to the hotel having fun. They were fucking insane. But they loved having fun. And like this program said, they were always had each other's backs and they were always together, whatever they were doing. Had I ever told you that story?
I think I remember you talking about Rick Steiner with a gun. The driving on the embankment, I don't remember.
You ought to remember everything that I ever say to you. We've only known each other for 30 years.
I remember when Rick Steiner first started out, him and Steve Williams and the UWF were driving to a show and they found like a car on the side of the road in flames and they rescued the people.
Oh, that's right. They was pulled the door. Two of them.
Yeah, they pulled the door off the car and saved the people.
Yes, and it made the local news, and they got a lot of attention out of that at that time. Yeah, some burning car. And again, nobody was shocked. But it was Steiner and Doc, and they jerked the car door off the fucking hinges to, okay, no problem. But that was, and nobody was surprised it was in the Mid-South territory with the shit going on the roads down there.
They talked a little bit about in 92, Scott and Bill Watts not getting along at all. Again, Rick Steiner had broken in pretty much under Watts. You could say he did some stuff before, but Watts is where he really got his first bit of attention. You surprised that him and Scott butted heads? Do you think it was only about the money issues, Watts trying to cut everyone's salary no matter what, and everyone who had a nice salary saying, what the hell?
No,
or do you think it was a personality thing that never would have worked?
You didn't hear the brief. They buried the lead here, but the brief line that Scott had about Watts, you didn't hear that? I mean, I don't even know that they tried to cut his money that drastically because I know in 1990, they were making $3,000 a week apiece. Now by 1992, that may have increased, and it probably did, but it wasn't like they were making outrageous money. But Scott said that he told Bill Watts what he thought about his son Eric's push, and I can hear that conversation. And if I was a betting man there, Smithers, I would say that the personality conflict came from Scott told Bill Watts, what the fuck are you pushing this gangly fucking blithering simpleton, as Bill Watts called his son Joel one time. You blithering idiot. Joel, you blithering idiot. No, I'm sure that Scott, in pretty blunt language, told Bill what he thought of Eric, and I think that's where that came from. And they kind of just mentioned that and went off in another direction. But
I don't know if that was the only thing. I think that might have been.
I bet that was probably the straw that broke the camel's back on one side.
Remember the end of their WCW run, right before Scott had he won like the TV title from Rick Steamboat and then was vacated when he left. But it was the Steiners against Gordy and Williams that summer.
Yeah, and that's why I said that's the kind of stuff that Watts loved, because those were classic matches and everybody was a legitimate athlete and a hoss, as the kids say. And so there was deep personality conflict with, I'm sure, with Scott and Bill, and partly over Scott probably talking to Bill Watts like he was not used to fucking guys talking to him that have been in the business for 3 years or whatever. But they started in the WWE, WWF, let's call it by its real name, since it was at the time, at the end of 92. And, honestly, they were successful there for the brief period that, the first 6-8 months of the year and that's when we worked with them, and I got in the middle of I didn't get in the middle of anything, but we were right there in the middle of the transition from them doing well in the WWF to start to tell Vince, hey, we need to fucking leave.
Yeah, their first several months in WWF was exciting. I was a big fan of theirs. I saw them live. I think they were on the first Monday Night Raw. It was a big deal. The Steiner brothers were there. They wrestled the Head Shrinkers, who they had a history of from when they were the SST.
Yeah.
In the NWA. They wrestled DiBiase and Mike Rotunda, and those, as a fan, were like the least exciting matches they could have, to me. Then we got them and the Quebecers, and I enjoyed that personally, but I don't know if they don't seem like Jacques Rougeau kind of guys.
Well,
but the Heavenly Bodies was the highlight of their run. Other than the Brett and Owen match, I think the highlight of their run was the stuff with the Heavenly Bodies. Specifically, maybe the one night that was the highlight of their run was SummerSlam 93.
Well, yeah, and the 4 weeks of TV we got to build up to it. But see, that was the thing. When they went to the WWF, they were some of the few guys at that point that were still interesting and watchable, and people wanted to see their squash matches because they were still doing all that shit. So impressive, right? And at the time, a lot of the WWF television so they were a breath of fresh air up there from what the guys were doing. But then when they got into it, as you said, with whatever teams, they were just so good, right? And they were, again, really different for the WWF. And so they've been there 6 months or so. And that was when completely, independently, not tied to them being there, me and the Heavenly Bodies showed up for me to work with Yokozuna, whatever. And they, at the time, they had said, well, we'll have the Bodies work with the Steiners at SummerSlam. Do you have a problem with them putting them over? Of course not. And so the Bodies came in as a new team for a build to work the SummerSlam WWF tag team title with the Steiners. And I thought, well, first of all, I thought there'll probably be some extension of that program, when they see how good it is or whatever. And then, so we did the deal, and it was the same formula as I just talked about earlier in the show, or earlier in this clip here, in that even though they didn't know Jimmy Del Rey at all, and I'm not sure if maybe Rick and Dr. Tom had met at some point, but really not worked with each other. But it was the same formula team. And, I'm kind of conveying the spots. Here's what we do and blah, blah, blah. So they knew we were going to do the same thing. They're from Michigan. They went to college at Michigan. We're in Detroit, or at Auburn Hills, as they say, the Palace. It's sold out. It's the biggest home state audience they've probably ever appeared in front of at that point in time. And they've got a team, one of my teams, that does that stuff to do all of their shit. So they were and they did all of Tom's shit and all of Jimmy's shit. And Jimmy Del Rey was fucking...
Yeah, Jimmy Del Rey was one of the people that after people watched that event, because most people had never heard of him before, and most people didn't even realize he was Jimmy Backlund or heard of Jimmy Backlund before. It was like, where did this guy come from? He stole the show.
Well, and that's because we knew for a few weeks out when we started doing the television, and I told Rick and Scott, I said, just watch their matches, watch the Bodies matches, because we had some TV matches where we did some shit. I said, watch their matches, you can see. I said, but we're going to do the same fucking thing, right, that we used to do. We're going to have fun and do all your shit. But watch what this guy does. And Jimmy was good. He was light. He was easy. And so that's the thing is Tom was, laid back, and he had obviously been that was a high profile position for him at that point in his career, but he'd, been in main events and worked territories and blah, blah, blah. Jimmy had just got the break, and he refused to believe and was shocked, and you could see it on his face that no, they're not going to. They're going to do the float over DDT, and oh shit, they want to do this and that. He was timid at first to ask the Steiner brother. I said, no, they're fine. Show them here. Boom, boom, boom. The fucking headlock. Ding. And and it was one of the better matches that either team had during that run that year in the WWF because of that.
I think other than the Brett and Owen match, which was a unique match, it's probably the Steiner brothers' best match there. Do you remember before the match started, again, hometown show, best night of their WWE careers, and they interview their sister at ringside before the match, and whoever it was, Pettingill or someone says, what was it like having these guys in the home growing up? And she goes, oh, Rob and Scott, there they are. It was the first time they used his real name on TV accidentally.
Yeah. Well, it's because, he's always Rob to her. And the sister and the mother was at ringside and the whole thing. And it tore the house down. People liked the fucking match, and they got over and had the belts up, right? And that's when I had already, because that was August 30th, I think, that year, right? That seems to stick in my head.
It used to be late August, so that sounds right.
But anyway, the first weekend of October, I had him 4 days in Smoky Mountain Wrestling. When we had first started, that's when I had talked to, at the time, it was Bruce and Pat, Bruce Pritchard and Pat Patterson, doing the booking for the house shows and the talent. I said, since we're going to be promoting this match on SummerSlam, can I have the rematch of my big October shows? Yes. And it was going to be for the WWF Tag Team title. And thankfully, before we ever announced that, when I was at TV up there, probably at it may have been the TVs after SummerSlam, but they told me ahead enough. Well, Pat came and said, well, I can't do the accent, bless Pat, but we're going to take the belts off of the Steiner. I said, and he said, well, we're putting it, and apparently that's when they found out they were going to switch the belts, which they did to the Quebecers, right? Jacques and Pierre.
That's right, with Johnny Polo.
Well, because unbeknownst to me, because I, again, wasn't asking Rick and Scott their personal business, that's when they had registered their dismay or disappointment to Vince with the money they were making, which wasn't exactly apparently the gold mine that he had promised them.
It's the same line, Shane Douglas years later, he had a big problem with WWF when he went up there as Dean Douglas, but he said the same thing, that him and his wife met to meet with Vince, and he said, you're going to make more money than you've ever made before in your life.
Yes.
And then it didn't happen. So I guess that was just a typical line that he used.
Well, and see, in the 80s, it was, you're going to have the opportunity to make more money, right? And then it gradually became, you're going to make more money. And then it started being that it wasn't more money because WCW started offering guarantees. So at any rate, so the Steiners did come down to make the dates, but it wasn't, they had lost the belts, so it couldn't be for the belts. But I think honestly, it drew the same, whether they had the belts on the line or not. But that's when Scotty had told me when we were talking about the finishes, because I figured if we slipped, because it was going to be Knoxville and Johnson City were the important towns that we were going to have footage of, and we were going to do a DQ because obviously I didn't expect them to put them over in that high profile situation, nor was I going to have them come in and beat the bodies and not come back. But I wanted them to split. I think it was Hazard, Kentucky, and Barberville also. Maybe we'll put you over one night there. You put them, so I could at least say it on television. Well, we beat them in Barberville. But that's when he told me, we got some problems with the office up there, and we don't know how much longer we're going to be there. And so they weren't going to be putting anybody over because, as we found out here they were already eyeing going to Japan. And Smoky Mountain Wrestling, believe it or not, was getting publicity in the Japanese publications. You've seen a bunch of it. So what happened there was reported in Japan. So Scott and Rick were old school. They couldn't do any jobs, which I understood. But that's when I found out that they were not happy. So they were there a year. So that their whole, as the team, as the Steiner brothers, their whole WWF career only lasted 12 months. Because they were like in December and out in December, right?
Yeah, that's why I always say 94 is kind of, for me, the end of the classic Steiner Brothers period. After that WWF run, they still went to Japan, and then they returned to WCW, but, you know, by the time they returned to WCW, it didn't feel like the same team anymore. Scott was much bigger, and that changed the way he worked. And Rick, not that he was disinterested, but just Rick didn't seem the same. He didn't have the charisma that he had just a few years earlier, so I am a big mark for the Steiner brothers, but I wasn't a big fan of their return to WCW.
Well, and I agree with you, and I think that it was a combination of bad creative, which, you know, plagued the whole company, and unless you were part of the chosen, focused people. With the Steiner brothers, they were WCW originals at that point, but they had to persevere through the fucking, you know, Hogan, NWO, Bischoff, that era where everything around revolved around that. And they didn't particularly use Rick as well as Scott. I think probably because Scott, as he said, pushed back more. I think Scott told him off a lot more. And you know, I think they may have seen possibly Rick was disinterested because they just weren't. They were lost in the fog in that size of a roster. Here's another. They were the giants of the locker room in 1990, and they were medium sized by the time they got to 96. So part of that aura of the Steiners, they had muddled it up with a bunch of other guys as big or bigger that didn't have the talent or the presence, but muddied the water. You know what I mean?
I do.
So I think all of that. But then Scott becomes Big Poppa Pump and Rick gets his real estate license. I think that's why Rick is more calm to this day, as Scott had another 15 years in the fucking wrestling business a lot of time to drive him absolutely batshit. But, you know, at the same time, Big Poppa Pump in WCW, it worked. In the WWF, it's another thing they didn't get. And I think by that point with Scott's injuries and et cetera. But Big Poppa Pump was a big deal in the WCW programs for that period of time. Where was it? Am I just misremembering that?
He was a big part of those shows. He got over big time as a heel. You know, at the time, I remember the big comparison was Superstar Billy Graham, because all of a sudden he showed up with the new hair, with
chainmail
hair, and he had two women with him. He ended up with that one, I think, Medeja, all the way to the end, but there was another one who was even hotter who was there at the beginning. And the other thing was, all of a sudden, you were talking about his promos. Because no one had ever talked about the Steiner Brothers promos or Scott's promos. Now he was unhinged as a heel. And you never knew, whether in kayfabe or not, what he was going to say. The whole idea of, oh my God, they're going to give Scott Mike, they're going to give Scott Steiner an open mic. That's the time when it started, the late 90s in WCW. Before that, he was never on the mic, really.
Well, see, that's the thing. Rick was good, especially in the Varsity Club and as the dog-faced gremlin was, and then later on in the, you know, the early years of the Steiner Brothers in that era, as being the goofy guy that could get serious, et cetera, physically, but he had that gimmick going. And Scott looked like an all-American guy, if an all-American guy was also a superhero. And he couldn't talk like a babyface, because as you can tell, that's not naturally him. I'm not saying he's a criminal and evil person. I'm saying he's not naturally a nice, pleasant guy with a cheery, he likes to have fun, but when he turned heel, he could let loose and he could be more of himself. And it was also a time where you could say more things on television than what you could have in 1992 or whatever. So, that's that was the difference, is that it was more of him naturally, which we always talk about being a big difference. So as a single, Big Poppa Pump was, it was very natural for him, and it was entertaining. And the TNA math promo, I was there the time he did that. And that was just something he did. It's not like anybody wrote it, wink, wink. But at the same time, then people would try to get him to do it again, and you could never do it again as good. If it wasn't planned and it's just something you do, when you try to do it again, it never turns out as well. But nevertheless, by the time that, go ahead.
Did you know, I guess we're going to that time period. Did you know about his whole thing with his foot, where he had a numb foot? He had no feeling in his foot for years?
Yes. He didn't call me up first thing when it happened to give me the diagnosis, but whenever the next time I worked with him after it happened, yes, I knew about it. So that would have been in TNA, I guess, right?
I think he said it happened at the end of WCW.
Well, no, but I'm saying the time that I would have next seen him.
Oh, yes.
I'm trying to think.
Yeah.
No, mate, no. He was in the WWF in the early 2000s. Didn't he come over briefly in the early? So the point is, a few years after it happened, the next time I worked with him, and, just in the process, and especially in TNA, because I was the agent on a lot of his matches, and, so you would discuss what you could do or can't do or whatever. I would see him taping his goddamn foot up. But what is that? Drop foot syndrome or whatever, whatever it's called. It's a condition where he basically had to tape it and wear tight boots and do the whole thing, where he was almost in a cast, because there was either not only numbness but nerve damage where he couldn't control, like, the part of his toes. If you want to go up the stairs and you want to not trip over the goddamn stairs, your foot will drop. Boy, this sounds like a real medical fucking explanation, but do you understand the words that are coming out of my mouth?
Oh,
he
I don't
couldn't
know.
just.
That's a lot to ask.
The ankle hinge. He couldn't just control that at random. That sometimes he couldn't control where the front of his foot was going or something to that effect. That's why he had to tape it real tight around the ankle and the foot. God damn it! If you need to see his medical fucking, get a court order. But that's the thing, is that he wanted to be the top guy in WCW. And unfortunately, he didn't get it till November 2000. When it was too late, they were about out of business, but he had wanted to be the top guy. And like a lot of guys in that era and eras before, and athletes, you go, well, fuck it. I'm going to tape it up. I'm going to go out there. Because he was ambitious. And also Rick said that Scott got kind of a bad attitude at that point because he thought people were out to get him and got a little crazy, was the quote. But finally, and so if one wonders from watching Who Killed WCW, if WCW was in somewhat, as Sebastian Cabot used to say, a classic state of disarray around about this time period, if I wanted to make up a funny story that bears no resemblance to people or events that actually exist in the world, but boy, it had been fucking hilarious if this really happened. If a person won the WCW World Heavyweight Championship, the big gold belt that Crockett had bought for Ric Flair back in 1986, if that person won that belt in WCW in the year 2000 and took it home in their bag with them, and because that office was so verklempt and preoccupied and bumfuzzled and gobsmacked that that person then brought back one of those good-looking replica belts that they started making about that time. And he kept that original belt in his office for years and years until somebody found out about it, at which point he would then sell that belt to that person for literal shoeboxes full of cash American currency, tens and tens of thousands of dollars. Well, that would be a funny story, wouldn't it, Brian?
Hysterical.
It would be hysterical.
Possibly criminal for the people buying the belt because they're buying stolen property.
That's why I just made that story up out of complete whole cloth, ladies and gentlemen.
What a funny story.
It would be so hilarious if that actually happened.
And then after they did that, they bought an NWA champion and his whole family. They got the whole package then.
Now, moving along here, that basically at that point, a few months later, WCW is out of business, and Scott again, you know, that's the point where he was really, I think, having trouble with it. Or I made note of the foot injury about this time, and you know, that's when he showed up to drop the belt to Booker T. That's what it was, with his boot all taped up and everything, because he, you know, say what you want about his bad attitude, but the company's going out of business. He's the champion, but they want him to drop the belt to Booker T, and he shows up with a bad foot and does it. So
last night of the company too. If there was ever a night where you got no show without repercussions, that's it.
Well, remember, Nash's opinion was, well, I'll sit home and watch the Titanic sink on my couch. And Steiner went injured to drop the belt because part of the bad attitude may just have been not taking that much bullshit. So anyway, at that point, that's when Rick said he got paid for a year afterwards to not wrestle at all and do anything that he didn't want to do. He went to Japan after that and missed his son's ball game, which he's got a couple of kids. I don't know if it was Bron Breakkers or not. And he came home and got his real estate license and stayed home for his kids. And that's been Rick pretty much, you know, since then, 15 years or whatever, more than.
And he seems really happy. It sounds like a happy life.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Because
Imagine having a problem with the school board and he's on the fucking board.
Oh my God. And I'll tell you what, Rick Steiner is the closest one that when you shake hands with him, he's got the closest hands in wrestling that felt like Lou Thesz's hands. The swollen knuckles, the calluses, the calcium from various broken bones from amateur wrestling. It's like it's an unusual fucking feel, and he's the closest one to it. So if he's shaking hands out there running for a school board, they're probably scared not to vote for it.
If you were running against him, would you be tempted to cut wrestling promos and put them online?
No, because then you're getting in a pissing contest with the skunk, as they say. You're playing right into his hands. You're going right down Steiner Alley. You're going to get Steiner line.
Well, you got to have backup. You got to have some kind of bodyguard. I'm booking the school board thing like a wrestling angle. All right, back to the documentary.
Let's go back to the show, because, you know, but there's Rick Steiner is at home in Georgia, and he's doing his thing, and Scott goes and has another run in the WWF that he doesn't like. And, you know, I don't think him and Vince were meant for each other. Just like him and Watts, and also his foot was bad at that point. And then he went to TNA, he said, to rehab his abomination of a WWE run. But then, so this is what so I knew about his foot earlier on, but the Puerto Rico thing is while I was in TNA, because I remember getting to television or the taping and hearing the news that he had torn his trachea And I said, how the fuck do you even do that? And he got kicked in the throat. Do you even remember who he might have been working with? I don't even know.
Oh, I don't
Can't
actually.
remember.
I don't remember, no.
But it was in Puerto Rico. Whoever might have been there then. But he got kicked in the throat, and it didn't tear his trachea in his throat. It tore it in his chest. And because he said, if I just torn it in my throat, I could have just had a tracheotomy and it would have been easy. You know, that's his outlook. But in the chest, they had to, because I saw this not long after it had fucking happened, and it just disgusting. They had to cut way around his rib cage under his arm and go past his lung some kind of way to repair his trachea part in his chest. And so that was like almost a fatal fucking thing that could have occurred if it had gone the wrong way to begin with. So, you know, that was definitely not good. And then his wife said she got pissed at him when he was like, "Oh, Doc, how much time do I have to take off?" And she's like, "Off? Fuck." And he was back in a couple months. And that's, you know, that was the things that he did. And when Rick, I meant to mention with the real estate license, he mentioned he was buying houses and flipping them with Rick Rude and Kurt Hennig and Bubba, Boss Man. Because I remember that's when Bubba, for a time when he was working as an agent, producer, whatever they called it back then at that point with the WWF, they sent him to OVW some. And we ought to get a cabin in Gatlinburg. And that was like maybe 6 months later, that's when Bubba passed away. But he had, because the Minnesota crew that became the Georgia crew, that he either knew from Vern or from, you know, Mid-South, and Rude had, you know, been around him for a long time. Because Rick had told me also at one point that apparently one of Scott's, I don't know, college friends or somebody he knew had become a hotshot financial advisor and said it made Scott a fucking fortune, and that was in 1995. So it was no wonder he was telling all these fucking people off about his money. Anyway, and you know, they finished the show up with Bron, but do you have any other Steiner-ish comments before we move on to the second generation?
Any Steiner-ish comments? Hey, fuck you, Cornette, you four-eyed jerk! No. Hey, Arnold, get him!
Sing him, Arnold, sing him.
Ric Flair, you're a piece of shit. Hulk Hogan, I'm gonna kick your ass. What else do you want, Steiner-like comments?
Well, no, any comments on the Steiner? And that was a funny thing also. I made sure when they came to Smoky Mountain, I told Scott, I said, we can't have the belts on the line. Bring fucking Arnold. And we'll make him your manager against me. And we did the boot spot with Jimmy Del Rey and Dr. Tom. He'd go after the fucking boot. And the people went out of their fucking minds. The dog was the star of the matches.
Those are good shows, too. You had Sherry Martel on those shows.
Yes. And so we had a little something for everybody. But nevertheless, any other comments about the Steiners before we move on to close with Bron and his generation?
I would just say to anyone who has not watched any of those matches from 1990, let's say 1989 to 1992 in WCW, watch every available one, especially against Japanese wrestlers. They're incredible.
And also, did we get in WCW, I'm just trying to think, that we dropped the U.S. Tag Team titles to them in the Meadowlands. And we had one
in the summer of 90.
Yes. And we had a bunch of house show matches where we put them over in cold matches pretty much during that period of time. And I think we had one TV match with them for like 10 minutes on syndication. And never had the Steiners on a pay-per-view. But would go and have the matches tore the fucking house down. But between the Ole regime and Herd, we could never do anything meaningful with him there.
You know, one other thing I'll bring up, because I just thought about it. There was a period there, 1990 or so, where people started realizing Scott Steiner is really special. Great shape, could do stuff no one else could do, legitimate tough guy. Remember, I think at the beginning of 1991, if I had to guess, they gave him a main event against Flair at the Clash. And it was a disappointing match just because they didn't mesh well together. But at that point, just a few years into his run there, people were already predicting he may be the future world champion.
Yeah, but what they did with that, to be honest with you, is they went with that for rating. It was Flair versus Scott in a singles match. They went with it for ratings, and because Scott was obviously a star, and et cetera, et cetera. But it was disappointing because think about this. How many singles matches had Scott Steiner had in the previous 2 years of his career at that point?
Not too many.
Maybe none. Unless they did an angle where Rick was hurt and Scott was in a single match on TV or whatever. They were always in tags. It's a whole different animal. So part of that was a point where that was one thing that, and I mean, of course, Flair can get something out of anybody, but it was not only a style clash, but it wasn't something where Flair could just naturally control the tempo of everything as he was used to, because Scott was not only too big to move around like that, but also may have had ideas of his own. And I think, but that's in some cases, that's why things like that don't come together. Anyway, a very entertaining program, and then they went to basically comments on Bron, which Scott said he's got the potential to be better than both of us, and I think I saw all three of. I'm seeing Bron now, and saw both these guys at this same stage of their careers. I think Bron is, because he's got the advantage now of having watched a template with his uncle and his father, that he's not going to just try to be a greatest hits, a tribute band or whatever, but he's got a template of being able to see someone that looks like him and moves like him and is shaped like him and has the abilities of him apply themselves to this while he was growing up. And now, and he's got the access to a great training facility and all these different mines and et cetera. So I think, he is ahead and should be, but at the same point, he's smarter now to the business, I think, that at this point in time than they were back then, because the only thing that he's missed is the time on the road and the territory. And otherwise than that, Bron's, formation has been more advantageous, and he's taken advantage of it. And then when Scott talked about they closed with him going in the Hall of Fame and all that stuff, and Scott said, "I came in peace." He don't want to screw Bron's chances up, and he'd probably gotten over it at that point. But I like that line. I came in peace. I could identify with that in the Hall of Fame ceremony. But it was awesome. Brian, is what it was. The Steiner biography was awesome, wasn't it?
It was awesome. Could have gone longer, but I thought it was an awesome documentary.
Well, since we're just talking about awesome things, wouldn't it be great, Brian, if you could just every month go to your mailbox or receptacle or orifice that you receive your packages in?
The mailbox. Called the mailbox.
Other pages, yeah, whatever, in different cultures, around the world. But if you could just go to that hole or holding area and open up a box of awesomeness, or just a box of awesome, as it's come to be known, every month, wouldn't that be just swell?
It would be awesome.
It would be awesome. Well, now you can, folks, because of our friends at boxofawesome.com. and the awesome things that they send you awesome people every month. And I got to lean over here because I couldn't. This item is so heavy, I couldn't put it on my desk. I was afraid it would collapse. Hold on. Oh, good Lord. It is the latest item that I've got in my box of awesome, the Thai, and that is from Thailand, right? Thai. The Thai, I don't know if my Kentucky accent translates around the world. The Thai moon knife set. It is a half moon shaped knife along with another knife that is shaped sort of like a quarter of a moon. I don't know, but I am no astronomer, but it looks to me like a layman to be about a quarter of that moon in a custom-made wooden box with beautiful brass hardware on this thing. It's engraved in the top of this deal what it is. It's authentic carbon steel made in Thailand. Hence why they call it a Thai knife. Listen to this. That, do you hear that ringing? It's almost like unsheathing Drew McIntyre's imaginary blade in his entrance music.
Oh, wow. It did sound like that.
Yeah, what that is that
careful.
Right there.
Just be careful.
Well, see, I'm sliding it slowly across the wooden box that it comes in, because you could cut somebody from asshole to appetite with this thing. But what it is meant for, it's for culture, for culinary purposes. And it's made from a small village in Thailand by talented blacksmith artisans. It can be used for anything in the kitchen. Both of these fine knives with the carbon steel blades and the wooden handles. And boy, howdy, heavy-duty workmanship there. And it came along, that's when I closed the top of the box, Brian. And it came alongside the Thai knife sharpening set. So you can keep these knives, as I mentioned before, sharper than a mother-in-law's tongue. So right there, that's what you get. Or you could get other things. Usually they give you things to commit mayhem with, and they give me things for the kitchen. This time my kitchen implement could also be used to commit mayhem. But if you'd like to whack down the
culinary mayhem.
Well, your culinary mayhem, just to and fro, chopping the vegetables and the fruits and the nuts and all those different things. But if you would like to whack down the weeds in front of you and some awesomeness, then sign up right now at boxofawesome.com. You fill out a quiz, they find out what you're interested in. Give them all your various hobbies or interest or collections or fetishes or whatever it may be.
Probably not fetish.
And they will then send you something related to that type of activity or proclivity on a monthly basis across a ton of different categories. They release these items every month, and they all come from small mom and pop businesses that have been propped up by these sales. So help out mom and pop. I guess, is AEW a pop business? Just Tony's not married, there is no mom.
Dysfunctional son.
A dysfunctional son business. Well, that must be where the 10% comes from. 90% of everything that comes in your box of awesome is from a small up-and-coming mom-and-pop brand, and 10% is from a dysfunctional son. But right now...
I mean, a lot of families have a fuck-up kid, you gotta think. A lot of mom-and-pops have a fuck-up.
Just by process of mathematics and percentages.
That's right.
You know, yeah,
right.
and just open your eyes and look at the street. See who's walking up and down it. But anyway, you get 15% off your first box of awesome. And that's certainly not a fuck up when you sign up at boxofawesome.com and enter the code JCE at checkout. And whether it's things to cook with or to eat or to hunt or fish or whatever you do with all those knives you keep stockpiling up there, Brian.
What knives?
And many more items of interest. I got a box of socks, very warm socks, a month or two ago. Knocked my socks off, it did. Boxofawesome.com, enter the code JCE at checkout. You're going to get 15% off your first box, which is already at a discount of up to 30% or more. You're not going to pay full price for anything around here, folks. You're just going to get full value. Boxofawesome.com. Enter the code JCE at checkout.